The story of Deep Purple and its offshoots, bands such as Rainbow, Whitesnake and Gillan, reads like an A to Z of British hard rock and heavy metal. First formed in 1968, Deep Purple's roots extend back into the R&B boom of the early 60s. Founder members cut their teeth in such groups as The Outlaws, Screaming Lord Sutch, MI5 and Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. The Purple story begins in 1967, when keyboard player John Lord, who'd been in groups such as the Artwoods and the Flowerpot Men, was approached by Chris Curtis, ex-drummer of the Searchers, with a view to forming a new group. Curtis had already come up with a name.
It was going to be called Roundabout, because roundabouts, man, go round, you know, and you get on and off a roundabout, don't you? You know what I mean, man? I'm going, yes. He said, so anybody can be in the band? Because those that want to be will get on the roundabout and stay on as long as they want, and then they'll get off the roundabout. Yeah, I said. Does this mean that I can be pushed off the roundabout? I mean, you know. He said, no. You and I, John, will be the core.
Roundabout was meant to include ex-Outlaws guitarist Ritchie Blackmore, but a year passed and Blackmore never showed. Curtis moved into Lord's flat and engaged in some unusual decorating work.
He covered everything in silver paper. So it keeps the vibes in, man. You know, so here was I trapped in this lunatic asylum. He eventually moved out, leaving me without paying his half of the rent, leaving me with a flat covered in silver paper. And suddenly it was December and there was a snowstorm. And I'm sitting there going, what the hell am I going to do? And there's a knock at the door and it was Ritchie Blackmore.
Ritchie Blackmore, even at this early stage in his career, was considered a guitar virtuoso. For a bass player, John Lord turned to Nick Simper, who had played in Johnny Kidd and the Pirates and the Flowerpot Men.
John Lord, he first approached me and said, would you give this up for, say, £25 a week? And I said, what do you mean, John? He said, well, if you could form your own group and create what you know, do exactly as you want to do and have control over it, he said, would you do it? I said, yeah, I'll do it. Yes, I'll do it. You know, tell me more.
They ditched the name Roundabout and decided to make a list of new names.
The list got huge. I mean, there was all sorts on it. Concrete God, I remember, was very strongly favoured at one point. Orpheus was another one. And several, do please remember it was 1968.
People had come up with ridiculous names, and every so often Ritchie Blackmore would say, what about Deep Purple? Because we all knew it was a title of a song, you know, hit song, Nino Tempo and April Stevens. Deep Purple.
Ritchie'd spoken to his grandmother. This new band you've got, are you going to play my favourite song, aren't you? And he'd said, what's that, Grandma? And she said, I like that song, Deep Purple. That's a lovely little song, you know. So it was Ritchie's grandma's favourite song. Deep purple falls over sleepy Cornwalls, and the stars begin to twinkle in the night. In the midst of
The band recruited Bobby Woodman to the lineup, but was still looking for a lead singer. Ritchie Blackmore favoured Rod Evans from the band The Maze.
Rod did his audition, we liked him, we took him on, and he took us to one side afterwards and said, you know, Ian, who's with me, our drummer from The Maze, he's a much better drummer than Bobby. We said, yeah, he's a kid. He said, no, he looks like a kid, he's 18 or 19, whatever. So Bobby wanted to go and get some cigarettes from the local pub. So while he was out getting cigarettes, we auditioned Ian Pace.
Well, I knew that, you know, it was something good happening and I wanted it. There was no qualms about, you know, oh, well, he's in there and I can't do this, you know. If you get a chance, you take it, and you take it with both hands.
With the addition of Ian Pace, the lineup of Deep Purple was settled. The band prepared to record their first LP, Shades of Deep Purple.
They pulled the single Hush off of the album, and that was being played on the Los Angeles radio about once every half hour, I think, to get the message across that we were there, you know, we'd arrived.
Listen, hush, hush, I thought I heard her calling my name. Now hush, hush, she broke my heart, but I love her just the same. Now hush, hush, thought I heard her calling.
They told us your single's bombing up the charts and you're off to America for 3 months.
It there were these fantastic American stretch limos we'd only ever seen in the movies, you know, where they'd take us to the hotel, and the hotel was fabulous. And 2 nights later, we're at the Playboy penthouse doing Playboy After Dark. Hollywood all of a sudden is ours.
This lineup of Deep Purple recorded 3 LPs, but pretty soon the cracks began to appear. At first, the band grew unhappy with vocalist Rod Evans.
Rod had met an American girl and very soon got bitten by the Hollywood bug, and he had aspirations to be a film actor. I mean, I think Rod genuinely believed he was going to become a movie star. His singing definitely went down. I mean, he just didn't seem bothered whether he was singing flat or not. He wasn't making the effort.
We were making our 3rd album, and Richie took me to one side and said something of the order of, you know, Rod isn't cutting it, and Nicky's bass playing is not what we need.
While Nick Simper and Rod Evans were unaware of what was going on, Ritchie Blackmore and John Lord went in search of a new singer and bass player. Ritchie got in touch with Mick Underwood, an old acquaintance. Mick played drums in Pop Group Episode 6 and recommended they check out lead singer Ian Gillan.
Ritchie didn't pitch up at many of our gigs, you know. Yes, he'd come to check him out.
At some stage or other, somebody would come along, would see this great front man with a fantastic voice, with oozing charisma, and snap him up.
I spoke to Richie, and he said, well, you know, yeah, let's have the singer, but why don't we have the bass player too, you know? And I said, well, we can try. So that's how we found the Gillan Glover duo, bless them, who really did change our lives.
I was terrified. I mean, it was a big transition. I mean, I'd done a lot of work, and I'd been with a lot of bands, and I'd done some tours. And with Episode 6, we'd covered quite a bit of ground. But this is something different.
I felt an enormous amount of guilt at leaving these people that I'd slept in vans with and struggled with and dreamed with and cried with. You know, it was time to move on.
That was it to me. There's no way we could carry on as we were with 2 members going. It was the end of the road as far as Episode 6 were concerned.
The news had still not been broken to Rod Evans and Nick Simper, but rumours were flying around the London music scene.
It came to the ears of a very close friend of mine. He said, I've heard this rumour, he said, that you and Rod are leaving. They got 2 new guys in. I said, every time a band has a bit of success, you hear these rumours. He said, I think it's true. And I just said, that's rubbish. I had that much faith in the band, and I had that much faith in the guys I was involved with. I just totally dismissed it.
We got our management to call Rod and Nicky. Terribly cowardly thing to do. I'd known Nick by this time, the bass player, for getting on for 3 years, I guess. Rod for 1 year, which was a little easier, but it's never a nice thing because, you know, asking someone to leave a band, it's like, it's a slight on what they themselves hold dearest, which is their belief in their ability.
John Lord, I'd considered my closest friend. I mean, I'd consider that guy like the brother I never had, you know. And it hurt, yeah, it did hurt. I mean, I never really saw him again.
We could have been a lot braver and nicer about the Nicky and Rod thing, you know. They still would have hated us, you know, for chucking them out the band.
Rod and Nick were replaced by Ian Gillan and Roger Glover. Ian and Roger felt they'd moved up in the world and wanted to kit themselves out in new clothes. they asked to see the Purple management team, Tony Edwards and John Coletta, to get an advance on future earnings.
I got the money. He said, and his words were, I knew you were trouble. The moment I set eyes on you, Gillan, if you ever come to me with any problems about money ever again, I'm going to throw you back in the gutter where I found you. Verbatim. That's exactly what he said to me.
They definitely looked down on us as being the two new boys who were being given this opportunity. This opportunity that if we didn't behave ourselves, they would take away.
The Purple management had a novel suggestion for exploiting the current popularity of the band.
Because he used to go to dinner with the bloke who owned Sanderson's Wallpaper, he wanted us to do Deep Purple wallpaper that was going to be on people's... Of course, he didn't realise. I mean, we'll go, oh, brilliant idea, Tony, yeah. Deep Purple bog paper as well, we should do some of that. I want my picture on that. And various other, you know, and they didn't understand at all.
The first recording project the new lineup was involved in was John Lord's fusion of rock and classical music, the Concerto for Group and Orchestra.
We suddenly had the Royal Philharmonic, the Albert Hall, and Malcolm Arnold, you know, one of England's greatest living composers, involved. And it was about, I don't know, 12 weeks to go. I used to come back from a gig to my flat in Fulham and start work. I used to work through till 8, 9 in the morning, then sleep during the day, and then off to the gig. Now, the rest of the band were not amused.
First of all, there was a wave of anti-concerto feeling. Started by Richie, and I went along with it. It was very early days in the band, and I saw some sense in what Richie was saying. He said, this is going to detract from what we're doing on our album. This is going to detract from the rock stuff. This is going to make people confused.
Ian Gillan, too, he sang beautifully, but he only wrote the words, like, I think, the day before the concert. You know, I've been asking him for weeks to write the words for the middle movement. I'll get to it, I'll get to it, I'll get to it. And he wrote them the day before. If you listen to the words, they are about him standing there in front of an orchestra when he wants really to be in a rock band. And how can I do this? You know, I don't know what I'm doing here. Get me out of this. Help.
What shall I do with the
So the rest of the band were not helping. But at the end of that night, you could have put their 5 smiles together and spanned the River Thames.
The next day, the papers were full of us, and it was really a press explosion. And John Lord suddenly became the main writer and main composer of the band, which really got up the noses of everyone else in the band, because he wasn't the main writer, the main composer, or even the leader, all of which he was touted as. And Richie in particular got very bitter about that.
It happened in London. It happened in the Royal Albert Hall. The world premiere of the Concerto for Group and Orchestra by John Lord.
If there was any jealousy as such, I believe the jealousy stemmed mostly from Richie. There was this kind of eminence grise in the corner, you know. I always imagine him on a perch, you know, like sort of peering. I mean, this guy's been part of my life for a quarter of a century, damn it, and I'm still, you know, esteemed at some of the things he did.
After the Concerto, Deep Purple went on to have a hit single with Black Knight. It was created one evening in a recording studio when Richie started playing around on the guitar.
And he started playing, do-do-do-do-do-do-do, hey, but we were drunk, you know. That's all right, let's do that. He said, no, we can't do that. That's Ricky Nelson's Summertime I was playing. Oh, fuck, I never heard it. Let's do it. where should we go from here? Let's do, let's go to the A, okay. Stop, and back to the riff again, okay. What are we going to write about? I don't know. He said, what about that old Arthur Alexander number we used to do in episode 6 called Black Knight? It's a blues soul record, I can't remember now. Yeah, we'll steal that title, okay, Black Knight. So what are we going to write about? I don't know, Black Knight. Don't feel too bright. Yeah, that'll do.
Black night is not right. I don't feel so bright. I don't care to sit tight. Maybe I'm right on the way down the line that I'm free to be me. Black night is a long way from home.
In those early days of Deep Purple, there was a definite sense that as a band we played our instruments to the utmost, that we weren't really doing it until we were hammering the hell out of them, hitting the strings as hard as you could, bending those VU meters over.
She's too much. She's never gonna leave my side. I need her. I want her. All right. I'm a rolling stone, baby.
The band embarked on a period of frantic touring and recording, a period which saw them at their height both commercially and artistically. But relationships were beginning to fray. The main antagonists were guitarist Ritchie Blackmore and singer Ian Gillan.
The last year of the band's life before 73, I don't think Ritchie or Ian Gillan spoke one word to each other.
I mean, I didn't particularly plan on having fights with him or anything like that. But, you know, I couldn't tolerate it. Couldn't allow this to happen.
They became two poles, because the more one would do it, the more the other would do it. And the more one got away with it, the more the other one was determined he was going to get away with it.
If you feel bad, oh Lord, I bet you have.
Things came to a head when Ian Gillan wrote his resignation letter while on tour.
I've never really understood what actually pushed him to sit down and write that letter.
To walk out of a band at that peak would seem stupid, but I couldn't find any other way to do it. I couldn't talk to anyone. No one would listen. No one would say, shut up.
It was the biggest shame in rock and roll, ever. God knows what we would have been, you know, over the next 3 or 4 years. We were writing so well.
I must have been pretty impossible for no one to come up and actually put an arm around me and say, you know, I'm sure we can work this out.
I was the youngest guy in the band, you know, and I just wanted to keep on playing. I didn't care about anything. I didn't care about how the other guys felt. I didn't care about how much money we were earning, when the tour started, when it finished. Okay, you're in America tomorrow. Okay, I'll be there. I had no concept of anything other than just going out and enjoying myself.
Ian Gillan was determined to leave, but his departure led to more upsets than just the loss of a lead singer.
Richie came to me and said, well, you know, like, if Ian's going, we might as well get rid of Rog. What? You know, well, he's... You know, why don't we get a... Look, we're going to go for a new singer, one who sings more bluesy. Aren't we? And I said, whatever. You know, I mean, why don't we get a bass player who sings too? Then we can have harmonies.
Again, I think that was more of a Ritchie decision, that. When Ian went, decided that Roger should go. And I suppose that Ritchie, being one of the elder statesmen of the band, together with John and I, just thought, well, that's the way you want it, that's the way to do it.
I don't know where I was really. I was extremely hurt. And I wanted to prove to them that, that even if they couldn't, at least I'd be a gentleman about it, and I'd commit myself through to Japan. And I was also hereby handing in my notice. I wasn't going to wait to get fired or eased out or anything. I said, sod it, I don't need this. And withdrew into myself. Richie didn't say anything to me in that whole tour, except right on the very last day, he came up to me and said, "It's not personal, it's business," and walked away. I hurt a lot, yeah, but, and I felt I was wronged. But I felt I'd been wronged more by Ian Paice and John Lord than by Richie. Strange.
And again, cowardice came in, and I went with the flow, you know. If I look back, if I'd have stood there and said, "No way, you know, come on," and he'd said, "Well, I'm leaving," and then we'd say, "Well, fine, leave." Who knows, again, what would have happened? You know, if ifs and ands were pots and pans.
The remaining Deep Purple musicians, Blackmore, Paice and Lord, set about putting a line-up together. They recruited bass player Glenn Hughes from the group Trapeze, and on vocals got a young unknown singer from the northeast, David Coverdale. Coverdale had only ever sung in local pub bands, so his first Deep Purple concert on a European tour was a whole new experience.
The manager at the time, a guy called John Coletta, was looking at me like, "You're going to blow it." I could feel it. And I took myself away from all of this bullshit nervous camaraderie that was going on and popping of wine corks and stuff, and found a room in the KB Halle just to be on my own. Well, of course, everybody thought I'd done a runner. So they had people, promoters, people searching the back streets and stuff, and I'm upstairs going, "You've got to do it, you know, you've got to do it, and do it properly." And that was the first time I walked on, first time in my life, and screamed, "How are you?" or "Are you ready?" or whatever. I didn't know what else to do.
He very quickly found his balls. You know, I mean, he wasn't that shy for long. And, for instance, when we did Smoke on the Water, which we had to do, of course, he wouldn't sing the opening line, like, which is "We all came down to Montreux." He sang "They all went down to Montreux" on the Lake Geneva shoreline.
Both Glenn and David were new boys and they did exactly what they were told. This is fine and dandy, you know, this is great. But after a record, all of a sudden they're not the new boys, they're part of the band. And they start putting their two penneth in. They start saying, "Okay, well, we're going to put our influence in now." And all of a sudden you do have a different sound.
That different sound, more influenced by soul and R&B than by hard rock, was eventually to lead to Ritchie Blackmore's departure.
During the making of Stormbringer, he would play us something. He said, "You like this? Play it." And we'd say, "Oh, that's great, let's try that." He said, "No, I'm going to make a solo album. I'll keep that for my solo album."
He announced he was leaving prior to the tour because he didn't want to play any of this shoeshine music, he called it, that I wrote and David wrote.
The management came over, we were in, I think, Germany or something, and said, "Richie's going to leave and form Rainbow." So yes, everyone was like, "Oh my God," you know, blah, blah, blah. So I went back to my hotel room and started to make a list of guitarists. But the first, of course, was Jeff Beck. The second was Rory Gallagher. And the third was Tommy Bolin.
Tommy Bolin was a gifted young American guitarist whose last job had been playing in the group The James Gang. He joined Deep Purple, but it was around this time that drugs began to play a part in the band's story. Glenn Hughes was facing problems with cocaine addiction.
It got to the point where the cocaine was my career. It was my everything. I would live to get up to go and do that stupid drug.
Glenn at that time, I mean, I met him recently and he's wonderful, back straight as a straight as a die, well in control. But in those days, he was very susceptible to anything that was going around. If he could sniff it, you know, inhale it, take it, he would do it.
Amidst being in denial of my own problem, I was in denial of Tommy's problem. Tommy and I would get high on cocaine and drink. But whilst he was doing that, he was also doing heroin and morphine.
Tommy Bolin's heroin habit caused real problems on a tour of the Far East.
What happened was we had a day off in Jakarta, and Tommy had asked the promoter to get him some downers or something. He got him some liquid morphine. I don't know if he injected it or swallowed it or whatever, but he fell asleep on his arm.
He was actually basically paralysed. All he could do was play a bar chord. So he had to tune the guitar to a major or minor chord, whatever he needed, and all he could do was play like that.
We went to Japan. We made that awful record, Last Concert in Japan, which should never have been released. I mean, for every Deep Purple fan that's got that, you know Tommy couldn't play.
We went round the world with him, unravelling Deep Purple's reputation everywhere we went. I mean, you know, it wasn't really happening. Glenn was singing more and more like Stevie Wonder every minute of the day, and Tommy was forgetting arrangements and bumbling around the stage, smiling a lot. In March of '76, we were playing, I guess it was the Liverpool Empire, and I came off the stage and I went up to Pacey and I said, I can't do this anymore. This is, the band I love is falling apart in front of my eyes. I can't do this anymore.
Ian Pace and David Coverdale agreed with John Lord, and Deep Purple decided to call it a day. 8 months later, in December 1976, guitarist Tommy Bolin died of a heroin overdose. Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, by this time, was an established act. In 1978, Blackmore asked ex-Purple bass player Roger Glover to join him. Glover had been producing and writing since he had left Purple in 1973. He was surprised by the offer because it had been Blackmore who had got rid of him all those years ago.
Somehow this was his way of saying he was wrong, or he had been wrong. And my value, although he hadn't seen it at the time, he'd seen it since in the work that I'd done, in the fact that I'd kept my nose clean, I hadn't spouted off in the press about, you know, what a bastard he was, and that I'd had some success. And he had a sort of a respect for me then that hitherto he hadn't. This is what I felt. Whether this is true, I don't know, but somehow it was a redemption.
Rainbow was very much created in the image of Ritchie Blackmore. Drummer Cozy Powell, who was in the band for 5 years, felt that it was Ritchie's driven quality that was the spur to Rainbow's success.
In those days, certainly with Rainbow, he really had a point to prove that he could do it without Purple, and this was going to be the band that was going to blow them all away and all that sort of stuff. And for a while, it did very well. And I think he had such determination. And I watched him go cold, as it were, over the years. He kind of lost that drive and that sort of anger.
You keep coming back to Ritchie. His presence looms over practically everything. He's searching for something that turns him on, and I don't think he knows what it is. He's a brilliant guitarist, one of these odd people that God pointed a finger at and said, "You, going to have something that no one else has got." And he's got that otherworldly quality. So much so that it's almost to the point that it destroys him. I don't know, maybe he can't handle how gifted he is. Maybe that's why he's weird.
In the meantime, 2 other ex-members of Deep Purple, John Lord and Ian Pace, had approached an old friend of theirs, keyboard player Tony Ashton, with the idea of starting a new band.
Pacey and I suppose over too many beers in a pub, had decided that a nice big band rock thing would be, you know, a la Mad Dogs and Englishmen, that would be great. And Tony Ashton was by then a close friend.
John, I think, put it to me, what do you think if
if Deep Purple did split, about what do you think about forming a band? And so, well, no, I don't honestly think it's going to work, because we're both keyboard players, and I'm not a front man really. I couldn't compete with the Gillans and Davids of this world, cover note. So I put it on the sort of back burner, and I think John kept on, and that, by this time I was getting a bit skint, I think. But I was hitting the bottle quite hard, and I don't know, I thought, all right, yeah, I'll give it a shot, you know. That was Pace Ashton Lord.
He started drinking because he was nervous, and ended up nervous because he was drinking, so it's... But then he stopped drinking entirely and got even worse.
Pace, Ashton and Lord did not last long. At a prestigious London concert in the Rainbow Theatre, Tony Ashton fell off the stage into the orchestra pit. Shortly after, the band broke up.
It wasn't his fault. We took him out of his area of expertise and tried to make him something he wasn't, which was a shame.
Another more successful offshoot of Deep Purple was the group Whitesnake, brainchild of singer David Coverdale. In the late 70s, hard rock was out of critical favour and punk was in. But Coverdale discovered on his first tour that there was still an enthusiastic audience for his type of music.
I booked what was called a Back to the Roots tour, because I didn't think I had any choice. So we booked all, you know, these little clubs and stuff, and there were more people outside than inside.
We played places, Wolverhampton, the Lafayette Club, which, you know, loads of musicians will know about, and David went out and punched his hand in the air and said good evening and put his hand through the ceiling, you know, things like that. So that's how small these places were.
It was tough, because all the people I was working with were expecting, you know, the sun to shine out of my superstar arse, which it wasn't. Nobody was backing me. The Purple management didn't have a clue what to do.
From this difficult beginning, Coverdale began to put together a successful lineup. He recruited ex-Purple colleague John Lord.
I formed this band, and we need a keyboard player. No, I'm sorry. I've given it up, David. I'm just gonna write. And phone call after phone call after phone call. You know, please come out and play. You know.
John joined Whitesnake. The Deep Purple connection was made stronger when Ian Pace arrived on drums.
It was his band. Even with John and I in the band, it was his band. It wasn't like all of a sudden Deep Purple again.
David had very, very much changed since he auditioned for Purple in 1973. He was very much more sure of himself, and he was reinventing himself as in front of our eyes, you know.
As David Coverdale and Whitesnake became more successful, a rivalry developed between the band and Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow.
If they can get to number 6, we'll try and get to 5. Can sell out the Hammersmith Odeon quicker than they can, or whatever. And there was a lot of that going down, and I think David loved it because, you know, he knew it was getting up Ritchie's nose.
This rivalry came to a head in Munich after a Rainbow concert.
The promoter made the enormous mistake of inviting me backstage. I said, "Are you sure it's okay?" Because there'd been bad blood between Ricardo and I for some time.
I got a call from Cozy saying, "Look, something's happened tonight. It's nothing to do with me. You know, it's between them. If they want to play kids, that's up to them."
Small corridor and it's packed, and suddenly I went, "I know that smell." And the next thing, he grabbed the back of my neck and the hair or whatever. He's going, you can get out." Fortunately, I got a swing round and stuff, and everybody was like, "Oh, no, what do we do? Interfere with Ritchie Blackmore and David Coverdale having a fight?"
Another ex-Purple vocalist, Ian Gillan, had had mixed fortune since leaving the group. After the demise of the Ian Gillan Band in the late 70s, he formed a new group, this time simply called Gillan, teaming up with his old Episode 6 colleague, Mick Underwood. The band were just on the verge of UK success.
Everything was right at the right time. The chemistry of the band was correct. The time was right for that chemistry to work. It was looking good.
We had a great tour. We'd finished the album. I couldn't get a record deal anywhere.
The band eventually got a deal with a small record label, Acrobat.
So they put the album out, and it went to number 12 in the first week. And then I got a phone call from Phil, my manager, said, got some bad news for you. Acrobat's just gone bankrupt, and they haven't paid their bills at CBS or something like that, and they won't press any more records. And so the album's disappeared out of the charts.
The album was such a success so quickly, they couldn't cope with it, and they actually didn't exist anymore.
We actually signed with Virgin then, and had 3 #1 albums after that.
Living wild and fueling my own desires. I was a wild man, drinking, smoking, messing around with women. Lots of women, no, not swimming. Women. I wanna go to heaven. The place to be is right up there. I wanna go to heaven.
The success enjoyed by the Gillan Band in the end caused their downfall. The reason was a falling out over money.
I got fed up with the rest of the guys moaning and groaning about too much touring, moaning and bitching every time there was a check late, because we were Brassic, moaning and insinuating that the books were being fiddled.
I found it particularly difficult with Ian because of, I guess, our relationship, really. I mean, we went back such a long way. To be honest with you, if it had been in any other band that I joined that was successful like that, I would have insisted on contracts and all sorts of things written down.
Sad, really, because Mick Underwood was a good old friend of mine. I always got on with Mick in Hounslow. We did have a little disagreement.